What if I told you that the legacy of one of America's most controversial presidents didn't vanish, but quietly transformed through a generation rarely seen by the public? Richard Nixon's name still echoes in politics, scandal, and history books around the world. But what of the grandchildren born into that same legacy? 4 young lives came into being under the weight of a father's reputation, a mother's resilience, and a nation's scrutiny. Their stories diverged sharply from what many expected. No grand political comeback, no headline-grabbing controversies, yet lives marked by ambition, privacy, resilience, and sometimes reinvention. Today, their paths tell us more about legacy, identity, and choice than the name ever could. Richard Nixon's legacy is inseparable from the turbulent history of the late 20th century. His presidency reshaped foreign policy, fractured political trust, and left behind a legacy debated for generations. Yet beyond the chapter that ended with resignation and redemption, there exists another story, one with far less visibility, but equal depth. His 4 grandchildren grew up not in the glare of their grandfather's political battles, but in a world carefully shaped by their mothers, Tricia Nixon Cox and Julie Nixon Eisenhower. These children inherited a name heavy with controversy and global recognition. Yet their lives unfolded through choices that distanced them from the stage that once defined their family. Some pursued public-facing careers, others sought privacy, and all navigated the complex inheritance of a name that carried both extraordinary history and profound personal cost. Their journeys reveal how a legacy forged at the highest levels of power can transform in the hands of the next generation, moving from political prominence to personal identity, from national significance to individual purpose. Richard Nixon rose from modest Quaker roots in California to become the 37th President of the United States, a journey marked by ambition, resilience, and ultimately by scandal. Through his marriage to Pat Nixon, he became part of the national spotlight. And together, they raised 2 daughters, Tricia Nixon Cox and Julie Nixon Eisenhower. Tricia and Julie grew up in a family where public service and political exposure were the backdrop of their childhood. But their upbringing also included a concerted effort by their parents to provide as much stability and normalcy as possible, despite the pressures of fame. As they matured, both sisters married Tricia to Edward F. Cox in 1971 and Julie to David Eisenhower in 1968. Their marriages expanded the family, and with them came the next generation, the 4 grandchildren who would carry the Nixon name into a new era. According to the official record of the family, these grandchildren are Christopher Nixon Cox, child of Tricia, and Jennie Eisenhower, Alex Eisenhower, and Melanie Eisenhower. Despite the weight of their grandfather's legacy, marked by both significant political influence and scandal, the Nixon grandchildren grew up largely outside the glare of national scrutiny. Their upbringing took place in a period when the family tried to redefine itself, away from the Oval Office, away from headlines, but still carrying a name loaded with history. The familial and generational contrast from presidential power to relative privacy created the context in which their personal stories would unfold. It is within this backdrop of legacy, expectation, reputation, and reinvention that the journey of Richard Nixon's grandchildren truly begins. Not as a continuation of scandal or political ambition, but as 4 individual lives shaped by inheritance, personal choice, and the quiet struggle to define identity beyond a famous surname. From this complex foundation of history, remembrance, and renewal, the lives of Richard Nixon's 4 grandchildren began to move in distinctly different directions. Each of them inherited a name that stirred powerful reactions. Yet none were raised to replicate the political path that once consumed their grandfather. Instead, their mothers built homes rooted in normalcy, academic focus, and quiet discipline, allowing the next generation to step into adulthood with the freedom to define their own identities. Some would embrace public-facing work, others would retreat into private careers, and all would navigate the invisible weight of a legacy that the world had not forgotten. To understand how the Nixon story evolved through the next generation, we must turn to each grandchild in turn, beginning with the eldest, Christopher Nixon Cox. Number 4. Christopher Nixon Cox was born on March 14, 1979, as the only child of Tricia Nixon Cox and Edward F. Cox, making him the eldest grandchild of Richard Nixon. From the moment of his birth, he carried a name that resonated strongly in American memory. Yet his life would unfold in a way that blended public visibility with carefully measured distance. As the grandson of a president whose legacy continues to provoke debate, Chris grew up navigating a world where the echoes of history hovered in the background, but where his parents insisted on a childhood grounded in education, structure, and the freedom to shape his own aspirations. He did not inherit Nixon's political stage, but he inherited the curiosity, discipline, and drive that had propelled his grandfather from modest beginnings to the White House. Chris spent his early years in New York, where the Cox family built a life far from the turbulence that had marked the later years of Nixon's presidency. He was a thoughtful and academically driven child, raised to understand both the significance and the complexity of his family's past without allowing it to dominate his identity. His parents emphasized personal achievement over inherited reputation, encouraging him to pursue excellence on his own terms. As he matured, Chris demonstrated a strong interest in government, foreign policy, and public affairs, subjects that mirrored the intellectual foundations of the Nixon legacy, while offering him the opportunity to approach them from a modern perspective. Schoolmates and teachers often described him as articulate, composed, and ambitious, someone who carried himself with the quiet confidence of a young man aware of his history, but not defined by it. His academic path reflected his commitment to building a career shaped by personal merit. Chris attended Princeton University, where he studied politics and developed a deeper understanding of international relations. After completing his undergraduate degree, he earned a law degree from NYU School of Law, positioning himself for a career that blended legal expertise with public policy. During these years, Chris began stepping more visibly into public life. He served as an advisor on international affairs, worked with think tanks, and engaged in political campaigns, including his own attempt to win a congressional seat in New York. His campaign drew attention not only because of his family name, but also because of his polished communication style and his ability to discuss global issues with depth and clarity. Though he did not win the election, the experience marked a significant moment in his public trajectory, signaling his willingness to engage with civic life while approaching politics with a more nuanced and analytical voice than the one that had defined his grandfather's era. Beyond politics, Chris expanded his career into business, law, and international consulting. He worked with investment firms, advised on economic initiatives involving China, and participated in policy discussions at events around the world. His professional endeavors reflected a blend of global awareness and strategic thinking, traits that aligned with the Nixon family's long-standing interest in foreign relations. Unlike his grandfather, who operated at the center of American political power, Chris built a career that moved across sectors, emphasizing diplomacy, economics, and cross-cultural dialogue. His work emphasized the interconnected nature of the modern world and showcased his ability to adapt the Nixon family's international legacy to contemporary realities rather than historical patterns. In his personal life, Chris maintained a public presence balanced by discretion. He married Andrea Katsimatidis in a high-profile ceremony in 2011, uniting two well-known New York families, though the marriage later ended in divorce. Despite the attention surrounding his personal life, Chris continued to focus on his professional pursuits, maintaining a polished public image rooted in discipline and careful communication. His interactions with the Nixon Presidential Library and Foundation further reinforced his role as a steward of the family's historical legacy, often representing his generation at commemorative events and discussions about presidential leadership. Today, Christopher Nixon Cox stands as the grandchild most visibly connected to the public sphere. His career bridges politics, law, business, and international relations, reflecting a modern reinterpretation of a family legacy once defined by power and controversy. He has carved a space for himself that acknowledges the history behind him, yet moves forward with a distinct identity shaped by education, ambition, and a steady commitment to public engagement. In him, The Nixon lineage finds a voice attuned to contemporary global challenges rather than the battles of the past, offering a glimpse into how legacy can evolve while remaining rooted in memory. Number 3. Jennie Eisenhower was born on August 15, 1978. The eldest daughter of Julie Nixon Eisenhower and David Eisenhower, and the first grandchild to unite two of America's most influential political families. Through her mother, she inherited the legacy of Richard Nixon. Through her father, she carried the lineage of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. This extraordinary intersection of history created a unique identity for Jennie, who arrived in a world where her name alone evoked two presidencies, two eras, and two contrasting visions of American leadership. Yet from early childhood, she displayed an instinctive ability to step beyond the expectations entwined in her ancestry. Rather than becoming a figure shaped by politics, Jennie grew toward the performing arts, developing a voice and identity grounded in creativity rather than public power. Growing up in Pennsylvania, Jennie experienced a childhood intentionally shielded from the pressures that came naturally with her family's name. Her parents made a conscious effort to protect her from political scrutiny, allowing her to develop her own passions without the influence of national memory. She attended local schools, participated in community activities, and discovered early on that the world of storytelling, theater, and performance resonated more deeply with her than the political world that defined the generations before her. This early attraction to the stage showed in the confidence and discipline she developed, traits often noted by teachers and classmates. Instead of carrying forward the public roles associated with the Nixon and Eisenhower dynasties, Jennie began shaping a future rooted in artistic expression, a choice that created a defining contrast within her historically significant family. As she matured, Jennie pursued formal training in the arts, attending Northwestern University, where she studied theater and deepened her commitment to acting and performance. Her talent became evident early, and she quickly began earning recognition for her work in regional and professional theater. Jennie went on to build a successful career as an actress, performing in numerous stage productions across the country and earning critical acclaim for her versatility and dedication to her craft. She appeared in both plays and musicals, demonstrating broad range and an unwavering passion for live performance. In addition to acting, Jennie established herself as a director and theater educator, guiding new generations of performers and expanding her influence within the artistic community. Her achievements reflected not only her individual talent, but also her determination to pursue a profession based entirely on personal choice rather than inherited expectation. In her personal life, Jennie sought stability and authenticity away from the lens of political speculation. She married and later divorced, raising a daughter while continuing her work in theater. Over time, she became increasingly open about her identity, publicly coming out as part of the LGBTQ community, a moment that underscored her commitment to living honestly and on her own terms. Her decision stood as a testament to her independence, marking a striking departure from the often rigid expectations associated with presidential families. Jennie's life became a model of self-definition, illustrating how an individual can honor their heritage while refusing to be confined by it. Today, Jennie Eisenhower is recognized not for political influence, but for artistic excellence, educational leadership, and personal authenticity. She represents a generational shift within the Nixon and Eisenhower lines, away from political legacy and toward individual purpose. Her career in the arts and her willingness to live transparently have made her a quiet but powerful symbol of personal agency within a family shaped by history. In Jennie, the story of the Nixon grandchildren reveals its first major transformation, a legacy reimagined not through public office or political achievement, but through creativity, integrity, and the courage to define one's own path. Number 2. Alex Eisenhower was born in 1980 as the middle child of Julie Nixon Eisenhower and David Eisenhower, placing him at the crossroads of two presidential lineages while growing up outside the public intensity that shaped earlier generations. Unlike his sister Jennie, whose early passion for the arts guided her into a visible career, Alex carried himself with a quieter reserve, choosing a path defined by privacy, discipline, and a deliberate distance from the political and historical weight associated with his family. From childhood, he exhibited a calm, introspective nature. Not drawn to public performance or commentary, but instead to the structured worlds of athletics, academics, and eventually, military service. His life would become a modern reflection of the Eisenhower legacy, steady, disciplined, and grounded in the values of commitment and duty. Alex's upbringing followed the same protective approach adopted by his parents, who understood more keenly than most the cost of being raised in the shadow of presidential heritage. He attended local schools in Pennsylvania, where he developed a reputation for humility and determination. Teachers and classmates often described him as focused, reliable, and quietly capable, someone who preferred action over attention. During these early years, Alex gravitated toward physical challenges and team environments, finding confidence in spaces where discipline and effort mattered more than ancestry. Unlike the public lives of his grandparents, Alex's childhood remained anchored in normalcy, a crucial foundation that would later shape his adult identity. As he stepped into adulthood, Alex chose a path that aligned with the values long associated with the Eisenhower side of his family. He enlisted in the United States Navy, committing himself to a career built on service, structure, and sacrifice, far removed from the political landscape that shaped his lineage. The Navy offered him a sense of purpose, rooted not in the past, but in the present, a world where legacy had no influence, and performance rested solely on personal ability. Through training, deployment, and the day-to-day demands of military life, Alex built a reputation as a disciplined and dedicated serviceman. His commitment reflected the same sense of responsibility that had defined his great-grandfather, Dwight D. Eisenhower, during his years as a military leader. Yet Alex never invoked his heritage. He earned his place through effort rather than name. After completing his military service, Alex transitioned into a private life marked by discretion and stability. He built a career outside public attention, choosing roles that allowed him to operate quietly and effectively, without the pressure of public scrutiny. Unlike some descendants of presidential families who moved toward politics, advocacy, or media, Alex charted a course defined by privacy. He married and raised a family, embracing a life centered on personal responsibility and the simple, enduring values instilled in him during childhood. Those who have known him describe a man shaped by integrity, humility, and a steadfast commitment to living life on his own terms, qualities that stand in deliberate contrast to the public turbulence that once surrounded his family name. Today, Alex Eisenhower remains one of the most private members of the Nixon Eisenhower lineage. His life reflects an intentional choice to step away from the expectations and narratives imposed by history, choosing instead a path marked by service, family, and quiet purpose. In him, the interwoven legacies of two presidential families take on a different form, not through political influence or public visibility, but through the steady example of a man who built a meaningful life behind the scenes. His story underscores a central theme that runs throughout the lives of Richard Nixon's grandchildren. Legacy may shape the context of a life, but identity is crafted through individual decisions, far from the noise of the past. Number 1. Melanie Eisenhower, born in 1984, is the youngest of Julie Nixon Eisenhower and David Eisenhower's 3 children, and the 4th grandchild of Richard Nixon. Arriving 16 years after her grandfather left the presidency, Melanie entered a world where the turbulence of Watergate had begun to fade into history. But the weight of her family's dual presidential legacy still lingered with quiet force. Yet even more than her older siblings, she grew up in an environment deliberately designed to shield her from the public's fascination with the Nixon and Eisenhower names. Her childhood unfolded with a sense of balance, grounded by attentive parents who understood how easily national history could overshadow personal identity. As a result, Melanie developed a soft-spoken, steady character shaped not by political expectation, but by compassion, empathy, and a desire to serve others in ways that reflected her own strengths. Unlike Jennie, who gravitated toward the performing arts, and unlike Alex, whose disciplined nature led him to military service, Melanie charted an entirely different course. From an early age, she demonstrated a deep interest in helping people and understanding human behavior. Teachers described her as kind, intuitive, and unusually mature in her ability to listen and connect with others. These traits guided her toward a field far from politics, psychology, and counseling. She pursued higher education with a focus on mental health, dedicating her academic journey to the study of how individuals cope, heal, and grow. Her choice represented not only her personal calling, but also a quiet counterpoint to the public battles that had shaped earlier generations of her family. As she transitioned into her professional life, Melanie became a licensed therapist specializing in childhood and family counseling. Her work took place in clinical settings far removed from the public eye, where she assisted children navigating emotional challenges, trauma, and developmental difficulties. In this environment, her family name carried no weight. Her impact came entirely from her professional skill and compassion. Her colleagues often described her as patient, capable, and deeply committed to the well-being of her clients. By choosing this path, Melanie demonstrated a form of public service rooted not in government or policy, but in human connection, a quiet but profound expression of empathy that stands in contrast to the often contentious nature of political life. Melanie's personal life, much like her professional one, has been defined by stability and privacy. She married and built a family of her own, focusing on raising her children with the same sense of normalcy her mother worked to provide for her. Her home life remained centered on the values of kindness, responsibility, and emotional awareness, values that echoed in her work and shaped her daily interactions. She rarely appeared in public settings associated with presidential heritage and largely avoided interviews or media presence. Instead, she maintained a deliberate distance from the limelight, choosing a life guided by purpose rather than notoriety. Today, Melanie Eisenhower stands as a testament to how a powerful legacy can transform across generations. Her life reflects the shift from the political world of Nixon and the military legacy of Eisenhower into a new chapter defined by quiet service, compassion, and emotional resilience. Rather than carrying forward her family story through political authority or public advocacy, she has done so through the healing work of supporting individuals and families. In Melanie, the Nixon legacy evolves into something more intimate and profoundly human, demonstrating how history can give way to a future written not by power, but by empathy. Among the 4 grandchildren of Richard Nixon, it is Christopher Nixon Cox who inevitably stands at the center of public attention. While each grandchild forged a path built upon personal values and private ambitions, Chris is the one who stepped closest to the world that shaped his grandfather. His professional journey through politics, law, and international affairs has placed him in the public sphere more frequently than his cousins. And his polished, articulate style has often reminded observers of the Nixon legacy, though expressed through a modern lens free from the turmoil of the past. Yet the context surrounding his prominence is not defined by nostalgia, but by the way he has chosen to reinterpret the family's relationship with public service. Chris's prominence stems not only from his education or professional achievements, but from the way he positioned himself at the crossroads of policy and diplomacy. Unlike the political environment that shaped Richard Nixon's rise, Chris operates in a 21st century world driven by global interdependence. His work with foreign policy groups, investment firms, and advisory councils shows a distinctly contemporary approach to leadership, one that blends national interest with international experience. For this reason, many have viewed him as the grandchild most capable of reviving a public-facing role for the Nixon name, albeit in ways that reflect modern expectations rather than historical patterns. His congressional campaign marked the most direct moment where the legacy of public engagement resurfaced within the Nixon family. The attempt placed him briefly under scrutiny, drawing comparisons to earlier generations and raising questions about whether a descendant of Richard Nixon could find a place in contemporary politics. Though the campaign did not result in a seat, It solidified Chris's role as the grandchild most willing to step into the national conversation. It also underscored a larger narrative. Legacy can be a burden, but it can also offer a platform from which to shape new ideas, break from old narratives, and redefine public identity. Chris's prominence does not overshadow his cousins, whose lives reflect the broad range of directions a presidential family can evolve into. Jennie's contributions to the arts, Alex's dedication to military service, and Melanie's commitment to mental health portray a lineage diversified by experience, rather than consolidated by politics. Together, they represent a family branching into new dimensions, but Chris remains the figure most visibly connected to the intersection of legacy and public life. His willingness to engage in political thought without replicating the trajectory of his grandfather positions him as the contemporary voice of the Nixon lineage, offering insight, analysis, and participation without inheriting the controversies that once defined the family name. Ultimately, Chris serves as the focal point not because he mirrors Richard Nixon's path, but because he symbolizes the evolution of the family's public role. His prominence reflects a generation's effort to reconcile the past with the present, to navigate history's weight while shaping new avenues of influence. In him, the Nixon legacy finds its most direct continuation, one that acknowledges the complexity behind it while moving toward a future defined by personal merit rather than inherited expectation. The story of Richard Nixon's grandchildren reveals a legacy transformed across generations, reshaped not by political power, but by the quiet determination of individuals choosing their own paths. Chris, Jennie, Alex, and Melanie inherited a name woven into some of the most turbulent chapters of American history. Yet none allowed that inheritance to dictate the course of their lives. Instead, they stepped beyond the scrutiny that once defined the Nixon family, embracing careers and values that reflected personal conviction rather than historical expectation. Their journeys diverged, but all shared a common thread: the pursuit of identity in the shadow of a legacy that the nation has never fully resolved. Through the 4 grandchildren, the Nixon story enters a new phase, one where ambition is balanced by reflection, where service is expressed not only through public office, but through art, military duty, global engagement, and the healing work of mental health. They represent a generation that carried the weight of their family name with a kind of deliberate steadiness, refusing both to capitalize on it and to be constrained by it. In doing so, they remind us that history is not inherited fully formed. It is interpreted, reshaped, and sometimes consciously set aside by those who live after the storm has passed. Their lives illustrate a truth that echoes across all great families touched by power. Legacy may begin in the public arena, but its future rests in private choices. For the Nixon grandchildren, those choices have produced a chapter defined not by controversy, but by resilience, reinvention, and humanity. As the next generation grows, the Nixon name continues forward not as a symbol of political turmoil, but as a reminder that even the most complicated histories can give rise to grace, purpose, and renewal. Through these 4 individuals, the story of one of America's most debated presidencies finds a quieter, more introspective conclusion, one written not by the force of politics, but by the strength of personal lives lived with intention.